Welcome to the War Archive, where wars become stories. Flames erupted before anyone understood what was happening, their glow flickering violently against the walls as the boy jolted awake to a scream that tore the night open. Smoke seeped into the hut through thin cracks, carrying the harsh scent of burning thatch mixed with the oily smell of spilled palm oil. Outside, frantic footsteps pounded across the dirt, sending vibrations through the floor that made the wooden frame tremble. His mother's breath brushed hot against his ear as she pulled him upright with shaking hands. When the door swung open, the night outside was already shifting the air thick with heat and floating embers that drifted like sparks blown from a blacksmith's forge. Shadows moved across the village in jerky motions, figures darting between huts with torches that hissed as oil dripped onto the ground. A nearby roof collapsed in a burst of sparks, filling the air with a choking cloud of ash that tasted bitter on the boy's tongue. The rebels' shouts blended with the crackling fire, each word sharp and urgent. His mother pushed him toward the back of the hut, her fingers clutching his shoulders with desperate force as the sound of boots grew louder. Gunfire erupted in quick bursts that echoed through the village, each shot leaving behind the sharp metallic smell of gunpowder drifting through the smoke. Dust rained from the rafters, with every explosion coating the boy's lips in a gritty film. Even the air felt hostile, thick enough that each breath scraped against his throat. The door splintered inward, wood cracking under the impact of a rifle butt, sending fragments skittering across the floor. A wave of hot smoke rushed inside, making his eyes water as he tried to stay hidden behind a woven basket that did little to conceal him. The rebels entered with the smell of sweat gasoline and damp earth clinging to their clothes, their movements jerky and restless. One of them yanked the basket aside, and the boy felt fingers clamp around his arm with a grip that dug deep into his skin. His mother lunged forward, but the strike from a rifle butt knocked her to the ground with a hollow thud that seemed to echo too long in the confined space. The boy cried out, tasting the iron of blood where he bit his tongue, but his voice was swallowed by the roar of the flames outside. As they dragged him from the hut, the night exploded with heat, the fire's glow spreading across the village like molten light. Smoke rolled across the ground in heavy waves, carrying the burnt scents of wood food and something darker he couldn't name. They forced him into a line of other children whose faces were smeared with soot, their eyes wide and reflecting the flames like glass. Sparks drifted across their skin, tiny glowing embers that vanished as quickly as they landed. Behind them, roofs collapsed one after another, each fall sending up a cloud of ash that blurred the shapes of running figures. The children's wrists were bound with rough rope that scraped their skin raw, the fibers carrying the earthy smell of mold and dried grass. As the rebels pushed them into the darkness beyond the village, the boy turned for one last look at his home, now swallowed by fire. The roar of the flames drowned out everything else, rising and falling like a monstrous breath devouring whatever remained. Embers spiraled upward into the night sky, glowing bright, before fading into cold, distant specks. Beneath the burning light, the boy felt a hollow space open inside him, shaped by the realization that nothing familiar would survive the night. Mornings in the village always began softly, with a cool breeze slipping through the thin wooden slats of the hut and carrying the faint scent of damp earth. Chickens scratched lazily at the ground outside their feathers, brushing together in dry rustles that blended with the low hum of early cooking fires. As sunlight filtered through the smoky haze rising from clay stoves, it painted warm, shifting patterns across the boy's bare feet. The calm felt so natural that he never questioned its fragility. His mother prepared porridge each morning, stirring a pot that released a sweet, nutty aroma as ground peanuts thickened in the bubbling rice. The steam curled upward and pressed gently against the boy's face, warming his cheeks while he sat cross-legged on the dirt floor. When he finally tasted it, the porridge coated his tongue with a creamy richness that lingered long after each swallow. Those moments, simple and repetitive, wrapped him in a quiet sense of belonging. As the sun climbed higher, the village seemed to breathe awake. Women laughed as they balanced water buckets on their heads, the rims clinking softly with each step across the packed soil. Men sharpened tools by dragging metal against stone, producing long, gritty strokes that echoed across the open yard. The scent of sun-warmed mango skins drifted lazily through the air, sweet enough to make the boy's stomach flutter with anticipation. Every sound and smell felt stitched into the rhythm of life he thought would last forever. The children spent afternoons playing near the cassava fields where the dust was warm underfoot and rose in small clouds each time they ran. Their laughter carried across the open space, bright and unrestrained, mixing with the rustling leaves of the cotton tree that towered over them. When they collapsed into its shade, their backs pressed against bark that smelled faintly of sap and rain-soaked wood. The boy always felt safe there, breathing in the earthy scent of the tree, while his heartbeat slowed to match the quiet around him. Sometimes his father took him to the fields where cassava plants grew in long rows that rustled with every passing breeze. The soil crumbled easily between their fingers as they checked the roots, its warm, grainy texture sticking to their palms. His father's hands were rough but steady, guiding the boy's small fingers with patience born from years of tending the land. Each successful harvest brought a smile that deepened the lines at the corners of his eyes, filling the boy with a warm pride he couldn't yet put into words. Evenings brought a familiar routine that felt as comforting as a lullaby. Smoke drifted from cooking fires carrying the sharp scent of peppers frying in oil and mixing with the heavier aroma of fish grilling over open flames. Families gathered in front of their huts as the sky shifted from gold to deep purple fireflies flickering to life like wandering sparks. The boy ate slowly, savoring each bite as the cool night air settled around them and the sounds of crickets rose in steady rhythm. At night, the village slipped into a cocoon of gentle quiet. Adults whispered stories outside the huts, their voices low and soothing, blending with the soft crackle of dying embers. The boy lay on his mat, the woven reeds creaking beneath him as he shifted, breathing in the earthy scent of mud walls cooling from the day's heat. Each inhale filled him with a sense of safety so complete that he drifted into sleep without a single worry. Darkness felt like an embrace rather than a threat. Rumors of armed men in distant districts floated through conversations occasionally carried on nervous whispers from travelers passing through. But such stories felt unreal, like storms that died before reaching the village, leaving behind nothing but faint echoes. The boy heard the words, but never truly felt their weight, too grounded in the familiar smells of home and the rhythm of days that flowed seamlessly into nights. He didn't know he was living inside the last days of a world about to vanish. The rebels drove the children into the forest before dawn, pushing them along narrow paths where roots twisted across the ground like hidden traps. The air was thick with humidity clinging to their skin in damp layers that made every breath feel heavy and warm. Leaves brushed against their arms with soft, wet slaps, leaving streaks of moisture that smelled faintly of sap and decay. The boy felt the earth shift beneath his bare feet, each step sinking slightly into mud that sucked at his heels. As the sun rose, the jungle revealed itself in overwhelming detail. Beams of light filtered through the dense canopy, illuminating drifting clouds of insects that buzzed around their faces in persistent swarms. The air tasted of crushed leaves, sharp and green, mingling with the metallic tang of fear that lingered on the boy's tongue. Birds called overhead in piercing cries that echoed through the trees, their sounds too bright for the darkness he carried inside. The rebels barked orders with voices roughened by smoke and sleepless nights. Their clothes were stained with dirt and streaked with sweat, carrying the sour scent of bodies pushed beyond exhaustion. Whenever one of the children lagged, a rebel prodded them forward with the muzzle of a rifle, the cold metal tapping against skin like a threat barely held in check. The boy felt each touch like a spark, sending currents of dread crawling up his spine. The deeper they moved, the louder the forest became its sounds, pressing in from every direction. Monkeys screeched angrily from high branches, shaking leaves that rained down in slow spirals. Somewhere nearby, water rushed over rocks with a constant roar, releasing a cool mist that touched the boy's face before vanishing into the warm air. Even the ground seemed alive, shifting subtly with the movements of unseen creatures burrowing through the undergrowth. By midday, the heat grew suffocating. Sweat dripped down the boy's back in steady lines, soaking into the waistband of his shorts and making the fabric cling uncomfortably to his skin. The rebels forced them to carry sacks filled with ammunition and rice, the rough burlap scratching against their shoulders with every step. The weight dug into their bones, leaving behind deep aches that pulsed rhythmically with their pounding hearts. The smell of gunpowder leaked from the sacks, sharp and bitter. When they stopped, it was only long enough to swallow a handful of murky water scooped from a stream. The water tasted of soil and algae, leaving a gritty film on the boy's tongue that didn't fade even after several swallows. His hand shook as he drank the cool liquid sliding down his throat and momentarily easing the burning dryness that had built throughout the morning. But the brief relief vanished quickly once they were forced back onto the trail. As evening approached, shadows stretched long between the trees, turning the jungle into a maze of shifting shapes that moved with every flicker of light. The rebels lit small fires that crackled weakly, emitting thin trails of smoke that smelled of damp wood and green branches. The children huddled together near the flames, their bodies trembling from exhaustion rather than cold. The boy rested his head on his knees, breathing in the smoky air and wishing for the soft scent of home he would never smell again. That night, as he listened to the distant howls of animals prowling just beyond the fire's glow, he realized the forest had swallowed them completely. The vast canopy overhead blocked the stars, leaving the world wrapped in a heavy, suffocating darkness. The boy curled tighter into himself, feeling the ground's cool moisture seep into his skin, and understood that whatever path lay ahead would not lead back to the life he knew. The jungle had become their new horizon. The initiation began before sunrise, when the air was still cool enough that mist clung to the forest floor like a pale, drifting veil. The rebels formed a loose circle around the children, their silhouettes barely visible through the haze, except for the dull gleam of metal where rifles caught the first hints of morning light. A pot simmered over a weak fire, releasing a pungent mix of gunpowder smoke and something chemical that stung the boy's nose. Every breath carried a bitter taste sharp enough to make his eyes water. One of the commanders stepped forward holding a small pouch, its fabric stained and stiff from use. When he opened it, the smell hit the group at once, a harsh, acrid scent of crushed cocaine mixed with the smoky residue of ground gunpowder. The mixture clung to the humid air, creating a dry, metallic tang that scraped at the back of the boy's throat. The rebels called it brown, their voices low and almost reverent as though naming a spirit. Even from a distance, the boy felt the danger in it. They ordered the children to extend their arms, their voices sharp and impatient. A rebel pulled a knife from his belt, the blade reflecting a faint orange glow from the fire, and made a thin cut across each forearm with a swift, practiced motion. The boy hissed at the sting-feeling warm blood surface immediately and slid slowly down toward his wrist. The air around the wound smelled of iron and damp skin, mixing with the earthy scent of the forest floor. He clenched his jaw to keep his teeth from chattering. When they pressed the mixture into the cut, the burn was immediate and overwhelming. The gritty powder sank into the wound with a heat that felt alive, pulsing in waves that traveled up his arm and into his chest. The boy tasted something bitter rise into his mouth, a chemical dryness that coated his tongue. The forest tilted slightly as if the ground had shifted under him, and a low hum filled his ears, blending with the distant drone of insects. His vision sharpened at the edges, yet blurred at the center. A rebel shoved a rifle into his hands, the metal cold and slick with morning dew. The weight of it pulled at his arms, but the drug's heat made the ache feel distant, muffled behind a growing numbness. The smell of gun oil drifted upward, mixing with the sweat accumulating on his palms. His breath quickened as the world grew both sharper and strangely hollow, filled with sounds that seemed too close, the crackle of the fire, the rustling of leaves, the low murmurs of the rebels. Everything felt amplified yet drained of meaning. They made the children practice firing into the trees each shot, echoing through the forest with a violent crack that reverberated in the boy's chest. Smoke curled from the barrel of his rifle, leaving behind a metallic scent that clung to his nostrils. The recoil pushed hard against his shoulder, but the drug blurred the pain, turning it into a dull thump that hardly registered. Leaves and bark exploded into fragments where bullets struck their earthy smell, mixing with the acrid scent of burned powder. As the ritual continued, the boy felt his thoughts drifting, moving like mist through the trees without form or direction. The mixture coursed through him in hot, erratic pulses, making his heartbeat throb in his ears. Sounds grew sharper, the snapping of a twig, the harsh breath of a rebel, the faint hiss of the boiling pot behind him. His skin tingled, sensitive to even the lightest touch of air, and the forest dampness felt as though it soaked straight into his bones. When the ritual finally ended, the rebels stepped back, satisfied with what they saw, children standing straighter, eyes wide and glassy, trembling, not from fear, but from the drug's relentless surge. The forest smelled of smoke and sweat and fresh blood drying on young skin. The boy's arms throbbed with a deep spreading heat, and his fingers tightened instinctively around the rifle. In that moment, with the mixture burning inside him and the forest closing in from all sides, he understood what the rebels wanted, not obedience, but transformation. The rebels marched the children toward a nearby village just after sunrise, the air still heavy with the damp smell of dew clinging to the underbrush. Birds scattered from the treetops as the group advanced their wings, beating frantically and leaving behind a faint fluttering echo. The boy felt the drug from the ritual still pulsing through his veins, turning every sound into a sharp vibration and every movement into something strangely distant. His fingers twitched against the rough grip of the rifle, the metal cool despite the growing heat. As they approached the outskirts, the rebels signaled for silence, raising clenched fists that glinted with sweat. Smoke drifted lazily from cooking fires inside the village, carrying the familiar scent of roasting plantains that once made the boy's stomach growl with hunger. But now the smell twisted uncomfortably in his gut, mixing with the metallic taste still clinging to his tongue. He tried to swallow, but the dryness in his mouth only grew thicker. When the first rebel fired, the gunshot cracked through the morning air with a force that seemed to tear the world open. The sound echoed between huts, startling chickens into frantic squawks and sending villagers running in all directions. The boy's heart punched against his ribs as screams erupted around him, blending with the rising smell of panic sweat dust and the sudden sharpness of burning thatch. Everything moved too fast, too loud, yet somehow felt muffled around the edges. A rebel grabbed the boy by the shoulder and dragged him forward, thrusting him toward a fleeing man whose eyes widened with terror. The boy felt the pressure of the shove more than he understood the order behind it, the drug's haze turning commands into vibrations rather than words. His hands tightened around the rifle, as if by instinct, the cold trigger brushing against his finger with a sensation that sent a shiver down his arm. The world narrowed to the sound of ragged breathing and the smell of trampled dirt rising in dry clouds around his feet. His first shot fired without conscious decision, the recoil slamming into his shoulder hard enough to jolt him backward. The bullet tore through the air with a high, violent snap, its path invisible, but its impact unmistakable as the man collapsed in a spray of dust. The boy's ears rang, drowning out every other sound except his own staggering breath, which tasted like metal and smoke. His hands shook violently, though whether from the drug or the act itself he couldn't tell. Around him the village dissolved into chaos. Huts burned as flames crawled up dry thatch, releasing hot waves of smoke that stung his eyes and coated his throat with bitterness. Rebels shouted orders, their voices rough and booming, carrying the smell of sweat-soaked cloth and gun oil as they rushed past. The cries of villagers rose in layers, fear, pain, disbelief, creating a cacophony that seemed to vibrate the very ground beneath the boy's feet. He could barely separate one sound from another. The rebels forced the children to continue shooting, pushing them forward whenever they hesitated. Each shot sent a fresh jolt through the boy's body, the recoil merging with the lingering burn of the ritual until his arms felt heavy and numb. Spent casings clattered against the ground hot enough to scorch skin as they bounced near his legs. The scent of burned powder hung thick in the air, mixing with the pungent odor of overturned earth and the faint sweetness of crushed food from broken cooking pots. By the time the attack ended, the village lay shrouded in rising smoke that drifted upward in slow, twisting columns. The fires crackled softly now, their earlier fury settling into a steady hiss as they consumed the last scraps of dry thatch. The boy stared at his hands, still trembling, the skin coated with a thin layer of soot that smelled faintly of charred wood and sweat. He felt neither triumph nor sorrow, only a hollow vibration in his chest that matched the fading pulse of the drug. As the rebels pulled the children back into the forest, the boy glanced once more at the burning huts, their shapes flickering like ghosts through the smoke. The heat radiated against his skin, even from a distance, carrying with it the acrid scent of destruction that clung stubbornly to his clothes. He turned away as the forest swallowed them again, but the image remained etched behind his eyes, glowing like a brand. Whatever innocence he still carried had been consumed in the fire. Days blended into one another as the rebels pushed the children deeper into the forest, their movements dictated by the unpredictable rhythm of raids and retreats. The air smelled constantly of sweat and gun oil, a sharp metallic scent that clung to clothes and skin like a second layer. Every night the boy felt the weight of exhaustion settle into his bones, but his body no longer understood rest. Sleep came in jagged fragments filled with the crackle of flames and the echo of gunshots that chased him even in dreams. Training became a relentless cycle that began before sunrise, when mist still clung to the undergrowth like damp cloth. Rebels barked orders while pacing through the clearing, their boots stirring the earthy scent of wet soil and crushed leaves. The children fired at makeshift targets carved into tree trunks, each shot sending vibrations through their arms as smoke spiraled upward in thin gray ribbons. The boy felt the rifle's recoil as a familiar jolt, now no longer startling but oddly grounding. Food was scarce, and hunger gnawed at them with an intensity that bordered on pain. Meals consisted of scraps, half-rotten cassava bitter greens, rice thick with grit flavors that left chalky residues on their tongues. The boy learned to ignore the twisting in his stomach, pushing it aside as he carried ammunition or fetched water from streams that smelled of algae and mud. Hunger became a background hum woven into every moment, as constant as the forest's insects droning above their heads. Drugs appeared often and without warning, delivered in quick gestures that left little room for refusal. Sometimes it was brown rubbed along their gums, leaving a sour chemical taste that lingered for hours. Other times it was a rolled leaf pressed into a shaking hand, its smoke swirling into their lungs with a sweet, acrid burn. The boy felt these substances warp the edges of reality, turning fear into heat hesitation, into movement, and guilt into something distant enough to ignore. Commands grew harsher as the rebels tested their obedience. Hesitation meant the sting of a rifle butt across the back, or the sharp slap of a palm that left his ears ringing. The boy learned to read the tone of each order by sound alone, the gravelly threat in a commander's voice, the rising pitch before anger snapped. Even the forest seemed to respond its sounds, pausing whenever tempers flared, as though the jungle itself held its breath. The boy moved quickly, silently, always aware of eyes watching him. Violence seeped into their daily rhythm until it became a language of its own. The rebels joked about raids while chewing on strips of dried meat that smelled of smoke and salt. They cleaned their guns with a casualness that sent the aroma of oil drifting through the camp like incense. The boy absorbed these rituals without realizing it, his fingers learning to check magazines and clear jams with practiced efficiency. The motions felt automatic, lodged in his muscles the way childhood games once had. Sometimes during brief lulls, the boy caught glimpses of what he was becoming. He would see his reflection in muddy pools, eyes sharper, shoulders tense, jaw clenched as if bracing for a blow. The water distorted his features, casting ripples that made him look older, harder, almost unrecognizable. He would stare until a shout or distant gunshot snapped him out of it, sending his pulse racing again with the taste of panic rising like metal in his throat. Those moments faded quickly, but left a lingering chill. At night, the rebels told stories that blended truth with menace, tales of enemies hiding behind every tree of villagers who betrayed them, of fighters who disappeared without a trace. The fire crackled beneath their words, releasing bursts of heat that carried the scent of burning wood into the humid air. The boy listened with his arms wrapped around his knees, the shadows shifting across his face as the forest hummed around them. Each story carved deeper grooves into his mind, filling the spaces where memories of home used to rest. By the end of the first month, the boy no longer flinched at the sound of gunfire, nor hesitated when ordered to act. Something inside him had hardened, reshaped by repetition, and fear molded by hands that valued brutality over childhood. The forest absorbed whatever softness remained, burying it beneath layers of sweat smoke and unspoken dread. When he lay awake, listening to the distant rumble of thunder rolling across the canopy, he sensed a quiet truth settling over him. The war was no longer around him. It was inside him, The boy met Musa on a humid afternoon when the air hung thick with the smell of rain-soaked leaves and sweat. Musa was older by only a year or two, but his eyes already carried a heaviness that made him seem ancient. He sat sharpening a knife with slow, deliberate strokes, the metal scraping against stone in a rhythm that felt almost calming. When the boy approached, Musa looked up and offered a faint nod, his expression softened by a tired familiarity. They bonded over small tasks, fetching water from a narrow stream where the banks smelled of wet clay and algae. The water was cool against their hands, a sharp contrast to the oppressive heat that clung to their clothes. Musa showed the boy how to cup his hands to avoid swallowing too much grit, the technique leaving only a faint, earthy aftertaste. In those moments, the forest's constant hum seemed to fade, replaced by a fragile sense of normalcy neither dared acknowledge aloud. One evening, as they sat near the fire, Musa shared a piece of roasted yam he had hidden from the others. The yam's smoky aroma drifted upward, cutting briefly through the harsher scents of sweat gun oil and damp soil. The boy chewed slowly, savoring the sweetness that lingered at the edges of the charred skin. Musa watched him with a faint smile, the firelight flickering across his face in warm, shifting patterns that made him look gentler than he ever appeared during the day. They whispered quietly at night, lying side by side on mats woven from palm fronds that rustled each time they shifted. Musa spoke of a village near Kailahun where the air always smelled of wood smoke and fermented palm wine during festivals. He described the sound of drums echoing through the night, a deep rolling rhythm that vibrated in his chest like a second heartbeat. The boy listened intently, letting Musa's memories fill the empty spaces where his own childhood recollections had begun to blur. During raids, Musa always drifted closer to the boy, not openly protecting him, but creating a silent buffer that made the chaos feel slightly less suffocating. The boy noticed how Musa's body tensed before each gunshot, his breath catching with a faint hiss he tried to hide. Sweat glistened on Musa's neck in thin lines that carried the scent of fear mixed with determination. In the madness of combat, Musa's presence felt like the only steady thing left in a world splintering at the edges. They learned to read each other's movements without speaking. A glance toward the ground meant stay low. A quick tilt of the chin signaled to shift left or right. The boy admired how Musa carried himself, not with the swagger of older rebels, but with a quiet alertness that seemed carved into his bones. When Musa placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder after a raid, the warmth lingered long after he stepped away, seeping through the grime and exhaustion like a small ember refusing to die. One night, rain hammered against the leaves above them, filling the camp with the cool, earthy scent of fresh downpour. Musa leaned close and whispered that he didn't want this life that he dreamed of running if the forest ever gave them a chance. The boy felt his breath hitch, the confession striking somewhere deep inside his chest. The sound of rain softened the sharpness of Musa's words, turning them almost tender. For the first time, the boy allowed himself to imagine a path beyond the trees. But as the storm subsided, the forest returned to its usual chorus of chirps and distant cries, reminding them of the dangers that surrounded their every step. Musa's whispered dream lingered between them, fragile and trembling, like a leaf caught in the aftermath of the rain. The boy didn't know whether to cling to it or fear it, but he held the memory of Musa's voice close, letting it echo in the quiet places inside him. For a brief moment, companionship felt like the one thing the war couldn't steal. The morning of the ambush began with an unsettling stillness, the forest unusually quiet, as though every creature sensed what was coming. The air felt heavier than usual, carrying the damp smell of leaves that had fallen overnight and begun to rot slowly in the humidity. Musa walked beside the boy with his rifle slung casually over his shoulder, but his steps were tense, each one pressing softly into the spongy earth. The boy noticed Musa's fingers tapping nervously along the weapon's wooden grip. When the first shot exploded, it tore through the silence with a violence that made the boy's entire body jolt. Birds scattered upward in frantic spirals, their wings creating a sudden storm of rustling feathers. The rebels shouted, their voices sharp and chaotic, mixing with the crack of gunfire that echoed between the trees. The boy smelled the sharp tang of burning powder, almost instantly stinging his nose and pushing adrenaline through his veins like fire. Chaos erupted in every direction as fighters dove behind trees, sending bark splintering into the air with each impact. The ground kicked up dust and broken leaves that clung to the boy's skin as he scrambled for cover. Musa grabbed his arm, pulling him to the base of a fallen log that smelled of damp moss and decaying wood. Their breaths came fast and shallow, tasting of fear and the metallic bite of the forest's thick humidity. More shots rang out, each one slamming into nearby trunks, with dull, brutal thuds that shook loose bits of debris. Musa raised his rifle, firing back with quick bursts that sent shells scattering across the ground like hot beads. The boy felt the heat radiating from Musa's body as they crouched side by side, the scent of sweat mixing with the acrid smell of gun oil. Above them, branches swayed violently from the force of the gunfire, dropping leaves that fluttered down like wounded birds. A sudden yell from the rebels sent a wave of movement through the clearing, urging everyone forward. Musa hesitated only long enough to give the boy a quick glance, his eyes sharp but filled with something softer beneath the fear. Then he moved dashing toward a tree further ahead, his boots kicking up bursts of dirt with each stride. The boy followed, heart hammering wildly, the world narrowing to the sound of Musa's footsteps just ahead. The shot that hit Musa was almost quiet, a muted crack nearly lost in the surrounding chaos. Musa stumbled mid-step, his body twisting in an unnatural arc before collapsing onto the forest floor. The boy slid to his knees beside him, the damp earth soaking into his clothes and releasing a cold, earthy smell that clung to his skin. Musa's breath came in shuddering gasps, each exhale carrying a faint warmth that dissipated too quickly in the morning air. Blood pooled beneath Musa, dark and thick, soaking into the soil with a slow, spreading warmth that carried a metallic scent. The boy pressed his hands against the wound, feeling the sticky heat seep between his fingers as Musa's breaths grew shallower. Musa's eyes flickered toward him, glazed with pain, but still trying to focus, as if wanting to say something he didn't have the strength to speak. The boy leaned closer, the smell of iron filling his lungs with every desperate inhale. Musa's final breath was a small, broken exhale that barely stirred the air between them. His body sagged as the tension left him settling into the forest floor with a soft rustle of leaves. The boy remained, frozen hands trembling and stained with blood, unable to pull himself away, even as the battle raged on around him. The forest sound seemed to retreat, leaving only the faint rustle of leaves and the distant thud of gunfire echoing through the trees. When the rebels dragged him back into formation, the boy felt the world blur around the edges. Musa's scent sweat-damp earth, and the faint sweetness of smoked yam still clung to his hands. The forest didn't pause to acknowledge the loss. Its hum returned indifferent and unchanging. As the boy stumbled forward, the space beside him felt unbearably empty, a hollow quiet that followed him through every step he took back into the jungle's shadows. They reached the outskirts of Freetown at dawn, when the sky was still pale, and the air carried the salty scent of the Atlantic drifting inland. The city felt tense, even from a distance, its usual bustle replaced by an eerie stillness that clung to the streets like fog. Smoke rose from scattered rooftops in thin gray threads, weaving upward into the humid morning air. The boy tasted ash before he even stepped onto the cracked pavement. As the rebels advanced, the city erupted into chaos. Civilians fled in desperate waves, their sandals slapping against the ground as they carried bundles of clothes and half-filled water jugs. The scent of fear hung thick in the air, sweat dust, and the acidic tang of panic carried in every hurried breath. Gunfire echoed between narrow alleys, each shot bouncing off concrete walls with a sharp crack that seemed to multiply. The boy followed the group, his heart pounding in rhythm with the explosions ahead. The rebels moved through the markets first, overturning wooden stalls that splintered loudly as they hit the ground. Baskets of cassava spilled across the street, mixing with crushed tomatoes that released a sharp, fruity aroma underfoot. Smoke from burning tires drifted low, leaving a greasy taste on the boy's tongue as he breathed. Vendors who once shouted prices in cheerful rhythms now screamed for help or vanished into hiding among the maze of corrugated metal roofs. Near the center of the city, the fighting grew harsher, swallowing the streets in clouds of dust kicked up by running feet. Buildings rattled as rocket-propelled grenades streaked overhead, their trails leaving behind a brief, bitter smell of burning propellant. Shattered glass glittered across the ground like scattered ice crunching beneath their boots. Sirens wailed from somewhere deeper in the city, their rising pitch slicing through the air with an almost physical sharpness. At one junction, the rebels forced the boy and other children to fire at soldiers defending a key checkpoint. The boy's rifle shook in his hands, its barrel scorching hot as smoke streamed from the muzzle. Each shot sent a jarring vibration up his arms, the recoil numbing his shoulders. He could smell the acrid sting of burning gunpowder mixing with the concrete dust swirling around them, thick enough to sting his eyes. Bodies fell on both sides, their shapes blurring into the haze. The city's heat intensified as fires spread, creating hot gusts that rolled through the streets in suffocating waves. Burning plastic filled the air with a toxic smell that settled in the boy's throat, making every breath feel like swallowing ash. Rebel commanders shouted orders over the roar of gunfire, their voices hoarse and ragged. The boy moved mechanically, stepping over debris that still radiated warmth. Somewhere nearby, a fuel tank ignited with a thunderous blast, shaking the ground beneath his feet. As the day dragged on, the boy found himself separated from the main group, wandering through a neighborhood filled with the crackle of dying flames. Abandoned cars sat idle with their doors hanging open, their interiors smelling of singed upholstery and spilled gasoline. A shattered billboard swayed overhead, its metal frame groaning with every gust of smoky wind. The air shimmered with heat, bending the light in waves that made the street feel unreal. He stumbled upon a quiet side alley where a wounded civilian leaned against a crumbling wall, clutching a cloth soaked in blood. The man looked up, his eyes glassy and pleading, but no words came out, only a shallow rasp that barely stirred the air. The boy froze, his fingers tightening involuntarily around the rifle's grip as the moment stretched painfully long. He stepped back slowly, the sour smell of infection filling his nostrils, and retreated without firing a shot. Some battles didn't require bullets to wound him. By nightfall, Freetown lay beneath a thick, choking haze, illuminated by scattered fires that flickered like dying stars. The boy sat on a broken curb, the concrete still warm from the day's heat and stained with soot. The distant rumble of gunfire rolled through the dark streets like thunder, its echoes bouncing off buildings that had lost their shapes in the smoke. His hands trembled as he rested the rifle across his knees, each breath shallow and tasting faintly of ash. In the glow of the burning city, he felt a weight settle in his chest, heavier than hunger, deeper than fear. Freetown's downfall wasn't just another battle. It was a point of no return, a moment when the war seeped into the cracks of the city the same way it had seeped into him. And as the last sparks drifted upward into the night, carried by waves of hot air, the boy understood that whatever awaited next would carve even deeper into him than the flames already had. The fighting eased only when exhaustion pulled the rebels back into the abandoned outskirts, where the air still carried the burnt smell of fuel tanks that had exploded earlier. Smoke drifted through the half-collapsed buildings in lazy spirals, mixing with the salty breeze rolling in from the sea. Loose papers skittered across the cracked pavement, their edges singed and curling from the heat. The boy followed the others into a looted storefront, the scent of melted plastic stinging his nostrils as he stepped inside. Inside the shop, the shelves were nearly bare, their metal frames coated with a thin layer of soot that smeared under their fingers. A broken freezer leaked stagnant water across the floor, releasing a sour, rotten smell that made the boy's stomach tighten. He sifted through scattered bags of rice, finding only grains crushed into powder and mixed with shards of glass. The dim light filtering through the shattered windows cast long shadows that shifted with every step, giving the room a restless, uneasy feeling. Outside, the remaining civilians crept along the edges of the streets, moving quietly to avoid drawing attention. A woman hurried past, carrying a child whose face was streaked with ash, both of them smelling faintly of smoke and fear. Their footsteps were soft, almost soundless, but the tremble in the woman's shoulders revealed everything the silence tried to hide. The boy watched them disappear into an alley, the echo of their fading steps lingering in his ears like a memory he couldn't hold on to. Rebel commanders regrouped near a blown-out intersection, their voices hoarse and heated as they argued over their next move. The The scent of palm wine clung to one commander's breath as he gestured wildly, his words slurring between bursts of anger. Another leaned on a burned-out vehicle, wiping soot from his face while muttering curses under his breath. The tension between them felt sharp enough to slice the air, and the boy kept his distance, sensing danger coiling just beneath their voices. As night closed in, the rebels set up camp inside a school whose roof had partially caved in. Dust coated the abandoned desks in thick layers, releasing a dry, chalky smell as they were pushed aside to make room for sleeping spots. The boy settled onto the cold floor, the concrete pressing against his skin with a steady, uncomfortable chill. Flickering flames from a small fire cast uneven light across the walls, revealing faint traces of children's drawings beneath the soot-stick figures, sunbursts, and crooked houses that felt painfully familiar. The rebels surrounded the fire, their silhouettes shifting with each spit and crackle as the flames consumed pieces of broken furniture. Conversations faded into low murmurs, thick with fatigue and bitterness. Someone lit a cigarette, its sharp, acrid smell quickly overtaking the scent of burning wood. The boy watched the ember glow brighter, with each inhale fading to a faint orange as the smoke drifted upward, curling into the dusty air like a ghost passing through the room. Later, lying in the dark, the boy listened to the distant echoes of sporadic gunfire still rattling through the city. The sound rolled through the night like the last tremors of a dying storm, each crack reminding him that the calm was only temporary. His body ached from days of marching and the relentless weight of the rifle that never left his side. The smell of sweat smoke and old concrete clung to him like a second skin, making it hard to breathe deeply without coughing. In the faint glow of embers, he finally allowed himself to think of Musa. Not the way he died, but the way he once laughed softly after sharing stolen yam. The memory brought a hollow ache that spread through his chest, leaving a bitter taste at the back of his throat. He curled onto his side, pulling his knees close to his chest as the night pressed in around him. Freetown lay shattered outside the broken windows, and in its ruins the boy felt the pieces of himself slipping further out of reach. In the days after fleeing Freetown, the rebels moved with a restless desperation, their footsteps snapping dry twigs that released sharp woody scents into the humid air. Every man seemed on edge, glancing over his shoulder, as if expecting British patrols to emerge from the brush at any moment. The boy felt the tension seeping into him, tightening his muscles, and making each breath feel shallow. Even the forest's usual rhythm insects, droning leaves rustling, felt warped by unease. One afternoon, a commander shoved a group of newly captured children toward the boy, his breath thick with the sour sweetness of fermented palm wine. The younger children trembled violently, their thin arms smudged with dirt and the faint scent of wet clay from where they had been dragged. The boy recognized their expressions, wide eyes searching for mercy that wouldn't come. He forced himself to look away, but the weight of their fear pressed against him like heavy, humid air. The rebels ordered him to teach the children how to hold their rifles, thrusting weapons into their small hands with impatient barks. The boy corrected their grips with the same harshness that had once terrified him, his fingers tapping against cold metal that smelled faintly of rust. Each mistake earned a reprimand from nearby rebels, their voices sharp enough to sting. The children flinched with every correction, their shoulders twitching like startled birds. During a march through ankle-deep mud, the boy caught one of the smaller children looking up at him with a pleading expression. Something twisted inside his chest, sour and heavy, like fruit left too long in the sun. The child's breath came in small, uneven gasps that carried the earthy smell of damp soil. The boy turned away quickly, feeling heat prickling beneath his skin as guilt and instinct collided inside him. Later, while gathering firewood, the younger ones moved slowly, their arms shaking from exhaustion as they struggled to lift branches slick with moss. The boy snapped at them to hurry, his voice harsher than he intended, reverberating through the trees like a slap. A child dropped his bundle, sending a spray of cold, muddy water across their legs. The boy opened his mouth to apologize, but the words caught in his throat and dissolved into the thick, humid air. That night, they sat around a small fire made of damp branches that sputtered and hissed as they burned. Smoke curled upward in uneven ribbons, carrying a bitter scent that made the boy's eyes sting. The younger children huddled close to him, seeking warmth, despite the fear that lingered between them. The boy stared into the fire, watching the glow pulse and fade as memories of his own initiation flickered behind his eyes. When he closed his eyes, he saw flashes of himself stumbling through the forest, clutching a rifle too heavy for his arms, flinching at every sharp noise, trembling under the weight of commands he didn't understand. Now he was the one issuing them, his voice sharp and clipped, forcing others into the same mold he had once resisted. A knot tightened in his stomach, tasting bitter and metallic on his tongue, as the truth settled over him like a shadow. By the time the fire dwindled into faint embers, the forest around them had fallen silent except for the distant chirp of insects. The boy wiped sweat from his forehead, feeling the grime cling to his skin in gritty layers that smelled of smoke and fear. He looked at his hands, dirt-streaked, calloused, wrapped around a rifle by habit rather than choice. They no longer resembled a child's hands, and in their shape, he glimpsed what the war was turning him into piece by piece in ways he couldn't escape. The announcement of the Lome Accord reached the forest on a sweltering afternoon when the air felt heavy enough to drink. Rebels gathered around a crackling radio that smelled faintly of hot dust, its static humming through the humid clearing. As news of amnesty and power sharing spilled from the speaker, the commanders erupted into cheers that carried the sour scent of fermented palm wine. Their laughter felt brittle sharp at the edges like glass rattling in a storm. Children weren't given explanations, only told the war was finished now, as if a word could erase years of violence clinging to their skin like smoke. The boy watched the rebels celebrate their movements, wobbling with drunken excitement as palm wine sloshed from metal cups and soaked into the dirt. The sharp, yeasty smell of alcohol mingled with the earthy scent of rotting leaves, creating a thick, nauseating haze. Despite the noise, a thin thread of unease vibrated beneath every shout. In theory, peace meant they should return home. But the forest told another story. Patrols continued, though the rebels now called them protection missions, as though renaming the violence softened its bite. Villagers still fled at the sight of armed men leaving behind cooking pots that still smelled faintly of smoke and half-burnt rice. The boy felt the same tightness in his chest as before, noticing how nothing, not the fear, not the hunger, not the tension, had changed at all. Rumors spread that some units were hiding weapons instead of giving them up, burying rifles beneath loose soil that released a cold, damp smell when disturbed. Others traded ammunition for food, the metallic scent of bullets mixing with the smoky aroma of roasted bushmeat at hidden market stalls. Whispers drifted through the camp like the buzzing of insects the British were moving. ECOMOG was rearming, something decisive was coming. Each rumor carried the faint tang of diesel drifting from distant engines. One night, while collecting water from a shallow creek, the boy heard a low vibration ripple through the ground. It wasn't thunder, it was too steady, too mechanical. The sound grew slowly like a heartbeat approaching from far away. The humid air carried the faint smell of fuel, thin but unmistakable, drifting between the trees despite the thick canopy. He crouched by the creek, fingers trailing through the cool water, feeling an unease coil through him like a tightening rope. Back at camp, tempers flared more easily. Two rebels argued near the fire, their voices slurred by palm wine but sharpened by suspicion. Sparks popped loudly as damp wood burned, releasing a bitter smoke that stung the boy's eyes. One man accused the other of planning to desert. The other threatened to shoot first. Their anger filled the clearing like heat radiating outward in waves that made even the children step back. The celebration that began as drunken joy slowly curdled into frustration and fear. Gunshots cracked sporadically through the night, not at enemies, but into the air in fits of rage. The explosions sent birds shrieking from the branches, their wings beating frantically in the dark. Smoke drifted above the campfires, carrying the sharp scent of burning palm fronds and spilled alcohol. The boy lay awake, feeling each gunshot vibrate faintly through the ground beneath him. By the time word spread that British forces had arrived and disarmament would be enforced, the boy no longer believed in phrases like "accord ceasefire" or unity. He only believed in the smell of diesel drifting ever closer, the rhythmic thrum of distant engines echoing through the trees, and the growing certainty tightening in his chest. Peace might have existed somewhere on paper, but in the forest it tasted like smoke, alcohol, and fear, and felt like the prelude to something far worse. The retreat did not begin with orders or shouting. It began with absence. One fighter slipped away at dawn, leaving behind only a shallow impression in the wet earth that smelled of moss and cold mud. Another vanished during a patrol, his footprints fading into the undergrowth before anyone noticed he was gone. Soon, the forest held more gaps than people each disappearance, tightening the unease that clung to the camp like humid air. Food became scarce almost immediately. The rebels dug through old cooking pits, scraping up charred scraps that tasted of ash and grit. The boy chewed bitter leaves that left a sharp, grassy aftertaste coating his tongue, offering only the faintest illusion of fullness. His stomach cramped in slow twisting waves that made it hard to even stand upright. Hunger no longer gnawed at him, it hollowed him out. Rain arrived with brutal timing, battering the canopy until sheets of cold water flooded the trails. Clothes clung to skin in soggy layers that smelled of mildew and sweat. The ground turned to sludge, sucking at their ankles with each step and leaving behind a sticky chill that seeped into their bones. The boy's feet grew soft and tender, the skin peeling in strips that stung every time he moved. The forest's breath felt colder, now more predatory. Disease followed close behind. Coughs echoed through the night, wet and ragged, carrying the sour smell of fevered breath. Some rebels burned with heat so intense the boy could feel it radiating from their skin, even in the rain-cooled air. Vomit soaked into the soil near the camp, leaving behind a sharp acidic stench that even the breeze couldn't scatter. Men who could no longer stand were left resting against trees, their eyes glassy and unfocused as insects buzzed around them. One morning, the boy passed a fighter slumped against a fallen trunk, flies gathering along his jaw in erratic clusters. The man's chest rose once barely, then stopped his final exhale, releasing a weak, sour odor into the air. No one paused to bury him. The forest simply swallowed the silence around his body as if absorbing him into its vast, indifferent rhythm. The boy kept walking, the image burned into his mind with a dull, unshakable ache. As days blurred together, the forest grew darker, its canopy filtering what little sunlight broke through the clouds. Shadows stretched long and thin, turning familiar paths into shifting mazes. The boy's breath came shallow and fast-tasting of damp leaves and the metallic tang of exhaustion. Every rustle of foliage made his pulse jump. Every snapping twig sent a tremor racing through his limbs. Fear and fatigue wove themselves into a constant numbing haze. Occasionally he glimpsed lone figures moving between the trees, emaciated rebels stumbling in different directions, their clothes hanging like wet rags from their frames. One man tried to speak as the boy passed him, but only a cracked whisper escaped, smelling faintly of decay. The boy didn't stop. Stopping felt dangerous, as though the forest itself might close around him if he paused too long. The air grew heavier the deeper he walked, thick with moisture and the scent of rotting vegetation. Nights became the worst trial. Darkness smothered the forest, completely swallowing every shape and sound except the rhythmic dripping of rain from high branches. The boy curled under broad leaves, shivering as cold seeped through his clothes and into his skin. His stomach twisted painfully, sending dull throbs through his abdomen that spread into his ribs. Sometimes he thought he heard footsteps nearby, but when he strained to listen, only the oppressive silence answered. By the second week, the retreat no longer resembled movement. It resembled erosion. The forest was stripping them away, wearing them down one step at a time. The boy felt himself shrinking, pressed thin between hunger and fear, evaporating under the weight of rain and disease. Whatever version of him had entered the jungle months ago had already fallen behind, left somewhere among the roots and shadows. All that remained was a body pushing itself forward, because stopping meant vanishing completely. The boy's body finally gave out on a morning when the forest felt unnervingly calm. Its usual hum softened beneath a blanket of lingering mist. His legs buckled without warning, sinking into the damp earth that smelled of wet leaves and cool mud. The impact sent a dull ache through his bones, but even pain felt distant, now softened by exhaustion so complete it blurred the edges of everything around him. He didn't try to stand. The effort felt impossible, like lifting a mountain with trembling hands. He lay on his side cheek, pressed against soil that radiated a faint cold moisture. Tiny insects scurried across his skin in light tickling patterns he barely registered. Each breath came shallow and warm, carrying the taste of stale air, and the earthy scent of decomposing vegetation. The forest loomed above him in blurred shades of green and gray, its towering trunks swaying slightly despite the stillness of the breeze. Even the sunlight filtering through the canopy felt thin, as though reluctant to touch him. Voices drifted somewhere behind him, muffled and fading as the remaining rebels continued their aimless retreat. Their footsteps snapped twigs that released faint bursts of sharp, woody aroma, but none of them turned back to check if he still followed. The boy didn't call out. The thought of forming words felt unreachable, buried beneath layers of fatigue. When their sounds finally dissolved into silence, it felt as if the forest had swallowed them whole. For the first time in months, he was completely alone. A soft rustling approached from somewhere beyond the trees, too steady to be an animal, but too controlled to belong to rebels. The boy tried to lift his head, but only managed a slight twitch muscles, responding sluggishly, as if underwater. The scent of something unfamiliar drifted toward him, a faint mixture of machine oil soap and the dry metallic hint of well-maintained weapons. The air shifted as figures stepped closer, their presence altering the quiet in a way the forest couldn't disguise. Boots pressed into the soil beside him, each step producing a low crunch that sent vibrations through the ground. The boy felt rather than saw the shadow fall across his body, cooling the patch of skin warmed weakly by the morning light. He sensed movement, a crouch, the soft creak of fabric, the muted clink of gear settling. A gloved hand touched his shoulder, steady and warm, the pressure firm but careful. The boy inhaled sharply, tasting dust and the faint scent of leather. Voices followed clearer now, but still wrapped in an accent he didn't fully understand. Their tone was calm, low-shaped by training rather than panic. One soldier lifted his arm gently, checking for a pulse with warm fingers that contrasted with the boy's cold sweat. The touch made his vision shimmer for a moment, edges brightening before dimming again. Another soldier spoke into a radio, the device crackling with static that mingled with the forest's distant bird song. They lifted him onto a stretcher whose fabric smelled of disinfectant and sun-dried canvas. As they raised him, the world tilted and swayed, leaving a faint, nauseating taste at the back of his throat. Branches brushed lightly against his arms as they navigated through the undergrowth, scattering droplets of dew that felt shockingly cold on his overheated skin. The steady rhythm of their steps echoed like a heartbeat, grounding him in a reality he struggled to process. When they reached the clearing, the boy squinted against the sudden brightness. Helicopter blades carved the air ahead, sending gusts of wind that smelled of exhaust and churned up earth. Dust swirled around him in gritty spirals, catching in his hair and clinging to the sweat on his face. The thump of the rotors vibrated through his chest, each beat sinking deeper as the stretcher moved closer to the aircraft. The noise grew louder, wrapping him in a cocoon of mechanical thunder. As they lifted him into the helicopter, cool air blasted across his skin, carrying the sterile scent of medical supplies. A medic leaned over him, checking his face with a focused intensity that made the world feel briefly anchored. The boy tried to blink, but his eyelids felt heavy, sliding shut as the helicopter rose. The forest shrank beneath him, dissolving into a patchwork of shadows and distant movement. He felt the noise soften into a low, enveloping hum. Wrapped in the hum of the rotors and the scent of antiseptic, the boy drifted into a silence unlike any he had known. Not the silence of fear, not the silence of the forest, but a silence that hovered just beyond consciousness as the world carried him somewhere he could not yet imagine. The boy woke to the deep rhythmic thrum of helicopter blades beating through the air like a slow mechanical pulse. The sound vibrated through the stretcher beneath him, sending faint tremors up his spine. A sharp smell of aviation fuel drifted into the cabin each time the doors opened, mixing with the sterile scent of antiseptic that lingered around the medic's gear. His vision wavered in and out of focus, turning the world into shifting patches of light and shadow. When the helicopter touched down, the shock of wind struck him first, carrying dust and the gritty taste of disturbed earth into his mouth. Soldiers moved past him in quick, efficient strides, their uniforms patterned in muted greens and browns that blended with the trees beyond. Metal clasps on their vests clicked softly with each step, mingling with the distant rumble of engines warming on the ground. A medic crouched beside him, adjusting the straps of the stretcher with hands that smelled faintly of soap and machine oil. Gunfire erupted before he could fully understand where he was. The sharp cracks cut through the early morning air, echoing off the tree line with a violence that made his heart jolt. The soldiers responded immediately, their movements smooth and rehearsed, dropping into formations that sent ripples of dust rising beneath their boots. The boy watched through half-lidded eyes as the nearest soldier signaled with a swift hand gesture, the muscles in his arm tight beneath the fabric of his sleeve. Rebels burst from the trees in disorganized waves, their footsteps pounding across the ground with frantic urgency. Their clothes were smeared with mud and sweat, carrying the sour smell of days spent hiding in the damp forest. Shots cracked erratically from their rifles, sending splinters of bark bursting from tree trunks in sharp, woody bursts. The boy tasted panic at the back of his throat, metallic and thick, even though he couldn't bring himself to move. The British soldiers countered with frightening precision. Short bursts from their SA-80s thudded through the air, each shot controlled and deliberate. Spent casings bounced across the dirt with metallic clinks, still hot enough to release a faint burnt smell. Smoke drifted slowly between the trees tinted blue by the morning light filtering through the canopy. The boy's breath quickened as he watched rebels fall, their bodies collapsing into the undergrowth with dull, muffled impacts. An explosion tore through the clearing, sending a wave of heat rolling across the ground. The blast rattled the stretcher, shaking loose flecks of dried mud that clung to the boy's arms. The air tasted of burning rubber and scorched metal as smoke billowed upward in thick, twisting plumes. Soldiers shouted orders over the noise, their voices muffled beneath the roar of gunfire and the steady beat of helicopter rotors slicing the air overhead. Through the chaos, the boy saw prisoners being escorted toward the landing zone, men in torn shirts, their faces streaked with soot and disbelief. One stumbled, and a soldier caught him by the arm, guiding him forward with surprising gentleness. The boy watched them pass, the smell of sweat and fear trailing behind them like a fading trail. Their presence felt distant, almost unreal, as though they belonged to a different world than the one collapsing around them. More soldiers advanced into the tree line, moving with a determination that caused the jungle to tremble beneath their synchronized steps. The ground shook faintly, with each controlled detonation used to clear rebel positions, sending vibrations through the boy's ribs. Leaves rained down from above their edges, singed and brittle. The air buzzed with tension thick enough that each inhale felt like dragging smoke into his chest. When the final shots faded, the clearing sank into a heavy, breathless quiet, broken only by the low hum of engines and the rustle of leaves settling back into place. Dust hung in the air in soft, drifting clouds that smelled of earth and cordite. The boy felt hands lift the stretcher again, guiding him back toward the helicopter as its rotors wound up to full speed. Wind whipped across his face, carrying the cold scent of altitude and something that felt strangely like relief. As the helicopter rose, the chaos below shrank into scattered shapes and thin trails of smoke curling lazily above the treetops. The boy felt the vibration soften beneath him, blending into the steady rhythm of flight. The smell of fuel dust and antiseptic merged into a blur as his eyelids grew heavy once more. Suspended between earth and sky, he drifted again into the quiet space where sound dulled and memory blurred, carried away from a battlefield he never chose to enter. The Rehabilitation Center smelled of bleach-boiled rice and damp laundry, a strange mixture that soaked into the walls and lingered in every hallway. Nurses moved in soft rhythms, their rubber sandals whispering across the concrete floors as they checked on boys who rarely slept through the night. The boy lay on a thin mattress that creaked each time he shifted its vinyl surface cool against his skin. Outside his window, palm trees swayed gently, their fronds rustling with a dry, papery sound that barely cut through the heavy heat. Group sessions took place under a canvas tent, where the air grew thick by midday, heavy with the scent of sweat and dust kicked up by restless feet. Former child soldiers sat in a loose circle, their voices quiet and uneven, as they recounted fragments of memories they'd rather forget. Some talked about waking to the smell of burning villages. Others described dreams filled with gunfire echoing through endless trees. The boy listened without speaking, each story stirring something heavy that sat like a stone in his chest. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission, set up a few yards away, drawing villagers who arrived with trembling hands and photographs worn soft at the edges. They spoke of sons who never came home, fields burned to ash, and nights spent hiding in corners that still smelled faintly of smoke years later. The boy lingered near the back, the sharp scent of dust and dried sweat swirling around him as testimonies piled up like layers of heat. Each voice pressed against him, but he couldn't tell whether the pressure came from guilt or something more fragile. When he needed space, he walked the perimeter fence at dusk, kicking small clouds of red dust that rose and hovered in the smoky orange light. Children played nearby, shouting as they chased a makeshift ball wrapped in strips of cloth. Their laughter rang bright and sharp, stirring memories he couldn't fully hold on to. But every sudden noise made his muscles tense, sending a metallic taste of fear creeping into his mouth. Even the pop of a distant cooking fire felt like a gunshot waiting to happen. The counselors encouraged him to take up a trade, and he chose carpentry because the scent of cut wood felt clean, untouched by war. In the workshop, sawdust drifted through sunbeams like tiny glowing motes before settling onto his arms in warm, powdery layers. His fingers learned to carve smooth edges, tap nails in straight lines, and fit pieces together until they held. Each completed shape left a faint thrill in his chest, but even the sharp crack of a hammer made his shoulders jerk before he could stop himself. Beyond the compound, life slowly rearranged itself. Markets reopened, filling the air with the smell of fried plantains and charcoal smoke curling upward in lazy spirals. Conversations shifted from fear to harvest school fees and rumors of better times ahead. The boy watched people move with a cautious hope, their steps still marked by the war, but no longer ruled by it. Yet whenever he heard the distant rumble of a truck, the memory of engines in the forest rose in him like a cold wave. Some evenings he walked to the small river at the edge of the compound where the air cooled enough to carry the scent of wet stone and algae. Fireflies hovered above the surface, blinking in patterns that felt almost deliberate as their reflections quivered in the slow-moving water. The boy crouched at the bank, letting the coolness seep into his skin as he dipped his fingers beneath the surface. Ripples spread outward, distorting the faint outline of his face into wavering fragments. The quiet there often felt larger than he expected, too wide, too empty, as if waiting for something he couldn't name. A breeze carried the faint scent of wood smoke from distant cooking fires, mixing with the earthy smell of the riverbank. Somewhere behind him a burst of laughter rose and then faded just as quickly. He lifted his hand, watching droplets slide down his wrist in thin, shimmering trails. Then he noticed a shape drifting just beneath the surface, long, thin, dark against the pale stones below. It shifted gently with the current, its outline neither clear nor entirely foreign. He didn't lean closer to see what it was, nor did he turn away. He simply watched as the current carried it downstream, its form fading gradually into the deepening dusk, like a shadow that belonged to him and would follow him quietly wherever the river led.